And now we'll turn to Dzodzi.
So I also want to thank Jayati and Chandru and the amazing team that worked together to organize this meeting. And for me, a development sociologist, this has been a crash course in understanding some of the economics of debt, debt restructuring, development financing, and climate financing. So I'm really grateful to all of you for your contribution to this learning. And so much has been said in these 2 days about Africa and Ghana's debt that I decided to recast my intervention to focus on the social protection strategy of debt restructuring, because that's something that we didn't talk too much about, in spite of very excellent presentations from Marisa here and now from Margarita. So I agree with a lot that has been said. One, about the structural and cyclical nature of the debt crisis. I think Ghana's 18 visits to the IMF testify to that, although we know that there are changes to the contours of debt and this current crisis, and the new role of private creditors, particularly the Eurobond holders in Ghana's case, has been flagged. And also new for me is that countries themselves are instituting austerity even before going to the IMF or in anticipation of going to the IMF. And lastly, undertaking domestic debt restructuring this time with all its risks. Chandru was talking yesterday about Ghana's example of domestic restructuring. It carries a lot of risk for the hard-won savings culture that we have in Ghana now, risks to the banks, but also to non-state social security providers such as pensioners and so on. We've also been talking about the impacts of 50 years of economic liberalization, but not much talked about is the liberalization of social policy. So I was listening very carefully to Margarita's points about financialization. But in the case of many African countries and also Ghana, is what neoliberal policies have done in separating economic and social policies so that they no longer cross-reference each other or draw synergies from each other, the increasing use of market instruments and the increasing financialization of social policy. And most important here is the departure from universalist social policies. And these policies have been very critical in the first decade of independence in Africa for the massive progress in social development indicators in education and in health and so on. Instead, this regression to targeted policies directed solely at the extremely poor has been damaging for the past 50 years. It's contributed to jobless growth because nobody talks about economic policy anymore in terms of whether it's creating jobs or not. It's contributed to the massive work precarity that we see, also to youth unemployment, and most importantly, to the stagnating progress in poverty reduction, the growing inequalities that we see, whether in gender, in spatial terms, or in class terms, and also to agrarian stagnation, something which Charles flagged this morning. It's also led to a massive crisis in social reproduction, with the subsistence and care economies subsidizing earnings from precarious work, but also deepening the plight of women. The COVID pandemic drew attention to this problem of the neglect of social policy, and also to social institutions, social infrastructure, and the deleterious effects. In fact, part of the fear about what would happen to Africa was linked to this epiphany that the neglect of social policy had been very damaging. And yet the COVID mitigation policies continue to ignore the care economy and the particular challenges for the subsistence and care economies, where the daily and generational reproduction of working people takes place. So There were no COVID policies to acknowledge the additional care and social reproduction burdens of women and girls, such as caring for the sick, both in institutions and at home, securing sufficient food for more people amidst food shortages and rising prices, educating and caring for children at home. In fact, women with very little education were expected to educate children at home in the midst of that crisis. But also coping with the various needs of larger numbers of people sheltering in overcrowded homes, which were not suitable for that level of intensive occupation, but also the risk in the increase in levels of domestic violence. We didn't see any policies that were acknowledging or dealing with these issues. Therefore, the debt crisis and the return to austerity is really unfortunate because it's now derailed any efforts to get countries to focus on a more expansive approach to social policy. I think two additional points need to be made about the debt crisis, and Margarita mentioned them, the question of household debt and individual debt. And this has been flagged in several reports, human rights reports, and the fact that they are linked with austerity measures, and therefore the idea that they could worsen. I was very jealous looking at your statistics because we don't have that kind of statistics for Ghana, and I really wish that some economists would begin to work on this issue so we could use the statistics. And the second is this financialization of social policy problem under the cover of financial inclusion, banking the unbanked, and so on, and the fact that it's been shown clearly to be deepening household debts. So with that in mind, who are the winners of this debt restructuring? I think the first winner, and probably many in this room would agree, is the IMF. It's back in the driving seat of African policy making and bringing the World Bank in tow. And in fact, what really staggered many of us is that when the government said that we are collecting new taxes so we don't bring in the IMF, people said bring in the IMF because you don't seem to know what you are doing. So the fact that people had forgotten what it was like to have austerity policies and the IMF programs was startling. Also, winners are the creditors who are owed money, because even if they take haircuts, I think people have said that they are not going to lose much because of the front loading of debt restructuring. A third winner, interestingly, is the central bank, the Bank of Ghana, whose autonomy is to be strengthened through legislation, and which has signed an MOU with the government of Ghana not to use monetary policies to ease government financial crisis. And this autonomy of the World Bank, of the Bank of Ghana, we thought it already had too much power, but now it is to be given even more power and also to be made less helpful to governments in crisis. A fourth winner in Ghana's debt restructuring are the independent power producers, with whom the government has agreements to pay for whatever power they produce, even if the power is not used. Rather than ask the government to abrogate or amend these problematic contracts, the IMF document states that the money will be ring-fenced so that they could be paid in full. And these IPPs are producing 20% of Ghana's power, but basically earn 60% of the revenue from power generation. And they are the beneficiaries of the dubious privatization agenda, which broke up the Volta River Authority and privatized the Electricity Corporation and introduced them. And these are two corporations that were considered to be some of the best run in Africa in terms of their achievements in producing electricity for Ghana. And yet, when they had financial problems because the government was not paying what it owed to them, the remedy was not to ask the government to pay, but rather to privatize them, because it was felt that private operators would have an easier time making the government pay. In terms of losers and losses, I think the first loss is the investments in economic growth and social infrastructure, and also the reform of social policy. Because although the program, the IMF program, mentions foreign direct investment and entrepreneurs and even talks about large-scale agriculture, something which I have a quarrel with, it mentions these as targets of medium-term investments without any concrete proposals. So the most concrete proposals have to do with the short term, basically the debt restructuring. The program also promises economic growth and investments in social policy in the medium term. Again, no timetable for this. And this is in spite of the promise to cushion the vulnerable. And there are no measures to address the vulnerabilities of anybody under the poverty line. It's only the so-called extremely poor. And the sum of interventions, in my view, is business as usual. There's the cash transfers, which was copied from Latin America, but extremely parsimonious. If you look at the amounts that are being paid, there's a school feeding program, and then there's a capitation grant, which is supposed to keep school fees low, and the National Health Insurance Scheme. And so what this means is that all the adverse impacts of the increase in taxes on taxpayers will not be mitigated because the money will first have to be spent repaying foreign creditors. The second set of losers have to do with cost recovery in utility services. And this affects all consumers, but especially the poor, because the lifeline threshold subsidy has been drastically reduced. And those in charge of reproductive work, the women who are having to pay more for water as well, will have to manage this domestic energy costs. And we know that if they don't have money, they have to find other ways of dealing with the crisis in energy. A third set of losers are public sector workers, and also the integrity and the effectiveness of the public sector. In addition to wage caps, there's a decision to reduce the wage bill through attrition, which means not replacing people who resign or retire or die. And this will affect the workforce in education and health, where wages are already low and lag behind in inflation. And it also has implications for the quality of these services in health and education and other social services. Fourth losers are the domestic bondholders. Now, domestic bondholders are not the poor in Ghana. They are Ghanaians who often work in the public and private sector, who saved for a long time over time. But many of them are older citizens who are in retirement and who look after themselves from their coupon payments. But not only do they look after themselves, because of the weaknesses of the state social security system, which includes very few workers, these are the people who also support the social security system in terms of looking after their poor relations and so on. And if these people stop saving because they've lost interest in the banking system and also in government bonds and so on, it's going to be very damaging in the medium term. The IMF document says glibly that there will be strategies to bring them back to the table. I think they must be joking. It probably might take a few decades to get the savings system back on track. And that also affects the banking sector, which is also a loser. It has been severely weakened by cleanup. We saw the closing of a lot of the locally owned banks, and its loss of profits from debt restructuring also has implications for its long-term health. Sixth losers, smallholder agriculture and the service industry, already affected by high input costs, plant diseases, which are linked with climate change and the erosion of purchasing power. And the program, therefore, is likely to compound the crisis in smallholder agriculture. Seventh is the world of work and working people. The economic contraction, the lack of investment in growth and social policy will only compound the unemployment and the expansion in precarious work and the burdens of reproductive work. So to conclude, I would say that no part of Ghanaian society and the Ghanaian economy has been spared, but clearly a few at the top quintiles of wealth can mitigate these impacts on themselves. What's disheartening is that the impacts have been brushed aside as long-term. And the argument in the IMF document is that this is short-term pain for medium-term gain. And it's not clear what this medium-term is. I was startled when our colleague from Argentina said Argentina took 18 years to clean up. And it's arguable that there's going to be long-term damage. These so-called short-term measures are definitely going to damage the social contract. People don't trust government anymore. They are damaging the social fabric, and they need to be acknowledged. This needs to be acknowledged so that we can moderate the austerity measures. In the IMF's risk analysis, it mentions social unrest as a high risk, and I'm not surprised about that. But the remedies proposed include strengthening governance and anti-corruption frameworks, implementing orderly fiscal consolidation, and strengthening social and financial safety nets. These might help, but it displays a misunderstanding of the depth of the crisis of social reproduction, which is facing the majority of workers. And this focus on cushioning the most vulnerable continues with this parsimonious social protection agenda, which is only targeting the poor, that I mentioned at the beginning. All the people who've now fallen into poverty and those above this imperfect extreme poverty line have basically been left to their own devices. The African Development Bank, for example, projected that the monetary cost of lifting the newly extreme poor to the $1.9 a day poverty line could be $4.5 billion in 2021, representing 90.7 million on average per country. Now, I doubt that any government in Ghana has that kind of resource to use or plans to use that. It's also clear that cash transfers on their own have not been an effective tool in poverty reduction. They actually need to be part of an expansive social policy, which is seen as an investment in building the productive capacities and productivity of citizens, also supporting social reproduction, redistributing the gains of economic growth, and protecting those who fall within the cracks, and also promoting social cohesion, citizenship, and the dignity of citizens. Right now, government seems to be only interested in protecting those who are falling within the cracks. And even the idea of who falls within the cracks is very narrow. It is three categories of people: people above 65 who don't have any other help, severely disabled people, and children who are orphaned or vulnerable. This is such a, I don't know how anyone could think that these are the only people who need support at a time like this. So I'm basically arguing that the approach we need to take is one that prioritizes economic growth and structural transformation alongside debt repayment, and not after debt repayment. We need that so that we can grow the economy, create new jobs, and promote the social, improve social sectors and infrastructure, and grow the economy in ways that benefits citizens. And anything less than that will set Ghana back by many decades. I thank you.
Dzodzi.